I still remember the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. I was standing at the edge of my lake, early morning mist floating over the water, when I noticed the garage door by the shoreline was cracked open. That garage was supposed to be empty. It always was. I hadn't used it in years. But inside, under fluorescent lights I didn't install, sat two classic cars covered in gray dust sheets. At first, I honestly thought I was losing my mind. I walked closer, heart pounding, telling myself there had to be some reasonable explanation. Maybe a neighbor asked for temporary storage. Maybe I forgot a conversation. But as I pulled one of the covers back, my stomach dropped. These weren't cheap weekend projects. These were restored classics. Polished chrome. Custom rims. Cars that didn't belong to anyone who would casually forget where they parked them. This wasn't just strange. It was invasive. For context, I live on a large lakeside property I inherited years ago. It's quiet, private, and deliberately separated from the nearby housing development. There is an HOA over there, sure, but my land has never been part of it. Different deed. Different zoning. Different access road. I've always liked it that way. No meetings. No rules about paint colors. No strangers telling me what I can or can't do on my own land. The lake garage sits right at the edge of the water, tucked away behind trees. Most people don't even know it exists unless they're looking for it. Which is why seeing those cars inside felt like someone had been watching me, studying my routines, waiting for me to be gone long enough to move in without asking. I checked the locks. They'd been replaced. Clean work, too. Not smashed or forced. Professionally swapped. That's when confusion turned into anger. Someone hadn't just wandered onto my property. They planned this. They felt entitled to it. Later that day, I asked a neighbor if they'd seen anything unusual. He hesitated, then casually said, "Oh, that's probably the HOA thing." I laughed at first because it sounded ridiculous. HOA thing? On my land? He shrugged and said something about a woman organizing storage for community assets near the lake. That's when the name came up. The HOA president. Known in the area for being pushy, loud, and obsessed with control. The kind of person who treats suggestions like laws and assumptions like facts. Apparently, she told people she had permission to use the lake garage. Told them it was community-owned. Told them it was all approved. Standing there later that evening, staring at those covered cars, I felt something shift. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was someone deciding that my silence meant consent. That my distance from the HOA meant I wouldn't notice. Or worse, wouldn't fight back. I closed the garage door slowly, locked my truck, and drove home knowing one thing for certain. Whoever did this thought they had authority over me, and they were about to learn just how wrong they were. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside felt louder than usual, every passing headlight a reminder that someone had crossed a line without hesitation. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering how long those cars had been there, how many people knew, and how boldly this had been done. By morning, confusion had hardened into resolve. I wasn't dealing with an accident or a favor gone wrong. I was dealing with an assumption of power, and assumptions like that don't disappear quietly. They escalate fast. By the next morning, the situation had already escalated. I hadn't even finished my coffee when a printed notice appeared taped to my front gate. No envelope. No signature. Just bold text stating that unauthorized access to community property could result in fines or legal action. I read it twice, slowly, waiting for the punchline that never came. Community property. On my land. I drove straight to the lake garage again, half expecting the cars to be gone. They weren't. In fact, there were more signs of activity. Tire marks in the dirt. Fresh footprints near the waterline. Someone had been there recently, comfortable enough to move around like they belonged. That confidence irritated me more than the trespass itself. Whoever was doing this didn't think they were sneaking. They thought they were entitled. Around noon, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered, and a woman's voice launched into a rehearsed tone before I could say hello. She introduced herself as the HOA president and immediately began explaining how the garage was being repurposed for the benefit of the community. No request. No apology. Just a calm assumption that I was already on board. I stopped her mid-sentence and told her she was mistaken. That the garage was mine. That the land was mine. There was a brief pause, followed by a small laugh, the kind people use when they think you're confused. She assured me that according to her records, the lake area fell under HOA jurisdiction. She said this like it was a settled fact, not an opinion. When I pushed back, her tone changed. Still polite, but sharper. She warned me that interfering with HOA operations could lead to penalties. She mentioned lawyers, compliance fees, even law enforcement if necessary. The absurdity of being threatened over my own property almost made me laugh, but the underlying arrogance killed the humor fast. That afternoon, a pickup truck with an HOA logo parked near the access road. Two men stepped out and began inspecting the garage from a distance, taking photos, pointing at the doors, measuring something with a tape. I confronted them, and they claimed they were just verifying compliance. Compliance with what? They couldn't clearly say. Word spread quickly. Neighbors started texting, asking what was going on. Some assumed I was part of the HOA dispute. Others quietly admitted they'd been told the lake garage was communal storage. The story had been repeated so often, so confidently, that people stopped questioning it. Authority, even when fake, travels fast. By evening, another notice appeared. This one warned of daily fines if I obstructed community use. I finally understood the strategy. Overwhelm. Paperwork. Intimidation. Make it easier to give in than to fight. They weren't asking permission because they didn't believe they needed it. Standing on my porch that night, looking out toward the lake, frustration settled into something heavier. This wasn't just about cars in a garage anymore. It was about someone testing boundaries, seeing how much they could take before resistance appeared. And judging by their confidence, they assumed there wouldn't be much. They were wrong. I wasn't angry enough to act recklessly, but I was calm enough to think clearly. Every threat, every notice, every confident lie told me the same thing. They hadn't checked their facts. They were relying on noise and pressure instead of truth. And people who do that usually panic when the truth finally shows up. The real weight of it all didn't hit me until a few days later. That was the moment when confidence drained out of the situation and left behind something colder. I came back from town to find the lake garage padlocked again, this time with a bright orange warning tag hanging from the handle. NO in compliance, it read, followed by a fine amount per day. They had escalated without hesitation. I stood there for a long time, staring at that lock. It wasn't just on the building anymore. It felt like it was on me, on my time, on my peace. The place I'd chosen specifically to avoid this kind of nonsense had somehow become the center of it. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd underestimated how far they were willing to go. Later that afternoon, a sheriff's deputy showed up. Not aggressive, not rude, just doing a wellness and property check based on a complaint. He asked a few neutral questions, took notes, and glanced toward the garage from a distance. I explained the situation calmly, but hearing myself say it out loud made it sound surreal. Someone hid cars on my property. Someone else claimed ownership of my land. And now I was explaining myself like I'd done something wrong. The deputy didn't take sides, but he also didn't shut it down. He said it sounded like a civil matter and suggested I resolve it with the HOA directly. When he left, the silence felt louder than before. No resolution. No protection. Just paperwork floating in the air like smoke. That night, the notices kept coming. Emails. Printed letters. Copies of HOA bylaws highlighted and attached as proof. Each one carried the same assumption, that I would fold eventually, that the pressure would work. And for a brief moment, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by documents I didn't ask for, I felt the edge of doubt creep in. Not doubt about being right. Doubt about how exhausting this could become. I thought about the time, the stress, the back and forth. About how easy it would be to just let it go for a while. Let them store the cars. Avoid the conflict. That thought scared me more than the threats. Because that's how this kind of thing wins. Not by force, but by wearing people down until resistance feels pointless. Sleep was rough. I kept replaying every interaction, every confident statement she'd made. The certainty in her voice. The way others had accepted her version without question. Authority has a way of feeling real even when it's built on nothing. And when enough people believe it, standing alone starts to feel risky. The lowest moment came the next morning when I found fresh tire tracks again. New ones. That meant more cars. More use. More assumption. They weren't waiting for an outcome. They were acting like it was already decided. Like my silence meant surrender. Standing there by the lake, watching the water ripple against the shore, I felt smaller than I had in years. Not powerless, but isolated. Outnumbered by paperwork, by noise, by a system that favors whoever speaks the loudest first. This wasn't a dramatic collapse or an angry outburst. It was quieter than that. A heavy realization that if I didn't handle this carefully, I could lose control of something I'd spent years protecting. And that's when something else settled in beneath the frustration. A clear, uncomfortable truth. If I was going to push back, I couldn't do it emotionally. I couldn't do it loudly. I had to do it precisely. Because people who rely on intimidation usually fall apart when faced with facts they can't talk over. By midweek, the haze of frustration had shifted into clarity. I started reviewing every document I could find about my property, my deed, the HOA boundaries, and even the original lake development plans. Every page I turned, every clause I read, revealed something remarkable. The HOA had no jurisdiction whatsoever over my lake garage or the surrounding land. The proofs were unmistakable: legal descriptions, survey maps, and my own property rights all lined up perfectly. They had assumed authority where none existed, relying entirely on their audacity and the ignorance of others. Armed with this knowledge, my mindset changed. I no longer felt reactive or defensive. Instead, I became methodical, calculating my next steps. The key was to expose their overreach without giving them room to claim confrontation. I drafted a letter detailing the property lines, legal precedents, and the exact violations of trespassing. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise, factual, and unassailable. Every word was meant to make their assumptions crumble silently. Next, I documented everything. Photos of the garage, timestamps of activity, notes from my conversations with the deputy and neighbors, and copies of every notice and email. I created a digital and physical record so comprehensive that even the most confident HOA member would hesitate to argue. The strategy wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about creating undeniable clarity. With the documentation in place, I contacted a local attorney, someone experienced in property disputes with HOAs. Their reaction was nearly the same as mine, incredulous at the boldness of this move. The lawyer confirmed my findings and suggested a simple, effective plan: notify the HOA formally of their lack of jurisdiction and demand immediate removal of the vehicles, accompanied by a deadline. There was no threat, no escalation beyond facts and legal clarity, just an unshakable assertion of my rights. Meanwhile, I started observing the lake garage more closely. Patterns emerged. The HOA didn't coordinate their visits. Their inspectors came at random times, taking pictures or making notes, but always from a distance. It became clear they were trying to build a paper trail of compliance without my consent, as if documenting their own perceived authority. That was when I realized another advantage, because I had all the evidence. Every move they made could now be countered with facts. Their confidence, built on assumption, was now their vulnerability. The day I sent the formal notice, I felt a calm satisfaction I hadn't felt since this started. No yelling, no confrontation, just precision. Later, when I saw the first response from the HOA president, it was noticeably hesitant. Her confident tone had slipped. There was more careful wording, more hedging. The arrogance that had defined every interaction now appeared nervous. Finally, I could see the shift in real time. The frequency of visits decreased, the casual boldness waned, and even neighbors started noticing the change. Where once there was an unchallenged presumption of authority, now there was caution. My quiet, fact-based approach had flipped the power dynamic entirely. They were on the defensive, unsure how to maintain the narrative they had spent so long controlling. Standing by the lake that evening, I felt the first real sense of control in days. Not because I had shouted or punished anyone, but because I had allowed the truth and the law to speak for me. The cars, the garage, the intimidation, they were all subject to reality, not assumption. And that clarity, calm and unshakable, would carry me through the final confrontation. The final confrontation didn't arrive with raised voices or flashing lights. It came quietly, almost anticlimactically, which somehow made it more satisfying. One morning, as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed movement near the lake garage. A flatbed truck was parked nearby, and two of the classic cars were already being loaded. No notices. No announcements. Just action. An hour later, my phone rang again. Same number. This time, the voice on the other end sounded different. Careful. Measured. The HOA president said there had been a review of the property records. She claimed there was some confusion about jurisdiction and that they were in the process of correcting the situation. No apology. No admission of wrongdoing. Just a quiet retreat wrapped in neutral language. By the end of the day, the garage was empty. The locks were gone. The warning tags had disappeared. Even the tire tracks were smoothed over, like they were trying to erase evidence that any of it had ever happened. A follow-up email arrived later that evening stating the HOA would no longer utilize the lake-adjacent structure. That was it. No fines mentioned. No threats. Just silence where pressure used to be. Neighbors started stopping by over the next few days. Some were curious. Others were relieved. A few admitted they'd felt uncomfortable about the situation from the beginning, but didn't want to challenge the HOA themselves. Authority only works when people believe in it, and once that belief cracks, it spreads fast. The narrative shifted. The same confidence that once carried her assumptions now worked against her. I never pursued damages or made a spectacle of it. I didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. The HOA stopped sending notices entirely. Their trucks avoided my access road. And word quietly circulated that the lake property was off-limits, permanently. The power they thought they had evaporated the moment facts replaced noise. Standing by the lake a week later, the water calm again, I realized how close this had come to becoming something much worse. Not because I was wrong, but because intimidation is designed to make people doubt themselves, to make them tired, to make them quiet. And for a moment it almost worked. What stayed with me wasn't anger, but clarity. The understanding that boundaries only exist if you're willing to enforce them. That confidence without authority is just bluffing. And that silence should never be mistaken for consent. The lake garage is empty now, just the way it was meant to be. Quiet. Private. Mine. And somewhere along the way, without ever intending to, I reminded an entire HOA of something they'd forgotten. Power doesn't come from titles, meetings, or loud assumptions. It comes from knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to move when someone tries to push you off your own ground.